The morning light streamed through the windows of Capitol Brews, a cozy cafe tucked away on a quiet street in Washington, D.C. Justice Eleanor Mitchell had discovered this place 3 years ago during a morning walk, and it had quickly become her weekend sanctuary. Today, like most Saturdays, she sat at her favorite corner table with a dog-eared copy of The Brothers Karamazov and a steaming cup of chamomile tea. Few people would recognize the 58-year-old woman in faded jeans and a navy cardigan as one of the most powerful legal minds in America. Her hair, usually styled conservatively for court, fell in loose silver waves around her shoulders. Without her black robes and the formality of the bench, Eleanor appeared to be just another patron enjoying a peaceful morning. And that was exactly how she liked it. For Eleanor, these Saturday mornings represented freedom. Freedom from the weight of decisions that affected millions. Freedom from the endless scrutiny. Freedom to just be a woman enjoying a book and a cup of tea. The cafe had been relatively quiet until the bell above the door chimed. 3 people walked in, bringing with them a burst of loud conversation and laughter. They settled at a table not far from Eleanor's corner, their voices carrying easily across the small space. "That reservation system is a joke," said a woman with sleek dark hair pulled into a tight ponytail. "I had to call in a favor just to get us a table for dinner tonight." "Speaking of jokes," replied a man with wire-rimmed glasses, lowering his voice only slightly. "Did you read that Supreme Court opinion that came down yesterday? The Mitchell opinion?" Eleanor's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around her teacup. She kept her eyes fixed on her book, but her attention had shifted entirely to the nearby conversation. "Oh God, don't get me started," groaned the third person, a red-haired man with a booming voice that seemed designed to fill courtrooms. "I stayed up half the night reading that disaster. Talk about out of touch with reality." The woman laughed. "I printed it out just so I could have the pleasure of throwing it in the trash." Eleanor turned a page in her book, though she hadn't read a single word. This wasn't the first time she'd overheard criticism of her work, but it never got easier. Still, there was something valuable about hearing unfiltered opinions outside the deferential bubble of the Supreme Court. "I bet Mitchell hasn't set foot in a real courtroom in decades," continued Red Hair, stirring his coffee with unnecessary force. "These justices live in their ivory tower, completely disconnected from how their decisions affect actual people." The woman nodded emphatically. "The reasoning was so circular I got dizzy reading it." "The worst part," added Glasses, leaning forward as if sharing a secret though his voice remained perfectly audible, "is how they pretend to be objective while pushing their personal agenda. Mitchell's background makes it obvious where her loyalties lie." Eleanor took a slow sip of her tea, keeping her expression neutral. She wanted to point out that they clearly hadn't understood the constitutional principles underpinning her opinion, but revealing herself would only end this unusually candid glimpse into how some members of the legal community viewed her work. "Can you imagine being one of her clerks?" Red Hair was saying now. "Having to translate those outdated ideas into something resembling legal reasoning?" The woman with the ponytail snickered. "I heard she makes them write everything out by hand first because she doesn't trust computers." This was patently untrue. Eleanor was actually known among her clerks for embracing technology more than some of her younger colleagues. The fabricated detail made her wonder how many other facts about her were circulating through Washington's legal circles. Their coffee arrived, but it did nothing to dampen their critique, which grew louder with each passing minute. Other patrons were beginning to glance in their direction. A young couple at a nearby table gathered their belongings and left, throwing annoyed looks at the increasingly loud group. "That part about community standards was the biggest load of nonsense I've read in a published opinion," Red Hair declared, his voice now filling the small cafe. "It's like Mitchell hasn't left her house since 1985. Eleanor glanced at her watch. She had planned to stay another hour, finishing her tea and reading, but the peaceful morning she'd looked forward to all week was effectively over. She considered finding another cafe, but this one was walking distance from her brownstone, and she wasn't ready to give up her Saturday ritual because of 3 rude lawyers. The barista, a college student named Zoe who knew Eleanor as a regular, but not as a justice, approached their table with a gentle reminder about the cafe's consideration policy. "Sorry, folks, but could you keep it down a bit? We try to maintain a relaxed atmosphere for all our customers." Glasses barely acknowledged her. "Yeah, sure, whatever." But their volume didn't decrease. "Did you see Mitchell's comment about modern technology?" The woman continued. "Classic boomer take. These older justices need to retire before they completely wreck the country." Eleanor almost smiled at that. At 58, she was actually one of the younger justices on the current court, appointed just 5 years ago after a distinguished career as both a litigator and federal judge. Their conversation shifted briefly to office gossip before circling back to the Supreme Court. "The problem with the court right now," Red Hair proclaimed with the confidence of someone who believed his law degree qualified him to redesign the entire judicial branch, "is that none of them have any real-world experience. When's the last time Mitchell rode the subway or worried about paying rent?" Eleanor thought about her 20 years as a public defender before becoming a judge, the tiny apartment she'd shared with her sister in the Bronx, and the subway pass she'd renewed monthly until her mid-40s. How strange to be so completely misunderstood by the very people who studied her words for a living. "Excuse me?" Eleanor finally said, her voice quiet but clear. The three lawyers looked over, seeming surprised that the solitary woman would address them. "Would you mind lowering your voices a bit? It's difficult to concentrate." There was a brief pause before the woman with the ponytail responded, her tone dripping with condescension. "We're having a professional discussion. Perhaps you could find somewhere quieter to read." "Yeah, there's a library down the street," added Red Hair, barely glancing at Eleanor before turning back to his colleagues. Glasses at least had the decency to look slightly embarrassed, but he said nothing in her defense. "This discussion about the Supreme Court opinion," Eleanor said, keeping her voice measured. "You seem to have strong feelings about Justice Mitchell's reasoning." "No offense, ma'am," said the woman, clearly meaning the opposite. "But this is complicated legal stuff. I doubt you'd find it very interesting." Red Hair chuckled. "Unless you've got a law degree hidden in that cardigan?" Eleanor allowed herself a small smile. "I have some familiarity with constitutional law." "Oh, really?" Red Hair exchanged amused glances with his friends. "And what's your take on Mitchell's interpretation of the Commerce Clause?" It was a test, obviously. They assumed she was just an older woman trying to insert herself into a conversation she couldn't possibly understand. Eleanor could have ended their smugness with a single sentence revealing her identity. But something held her back. Perhaps it was the rare opportunity to engage with legal minds who weren't afraid to disagree with her, even if their disagreement was wrapped in disrespect. "I think," she said carefully, "that the opinion shows more concern for precedent than for practical application. But I'd need to read it more carefully before making a final judgment." The three lawyers looked surprised, clearly not expecting an intelligent response. "Well," said Glasses, somewhat recovered, "that's actually a fair criticism. But the bigger issue is how disconnected the reasoning is from real-world consequences." Eleanor nodded thoughtfully. "The tension between legal theory and practical impact is always challenging. Have you considered that the justice might be constrained by the specific question presented to the court?" The woman narrowed her eyes. "Are you a lawyer?" "Just a citizen interested in our judicial system," Eleanor replied. It wasn't exactly a lie. "Well, just a citizen," Red Hair said with a smirk. "Maybe stick to fiction books. Leave the constitutional analysis to the professionals." The woman in Glasses laughed, and they turned back to each other, effectively dismissing Eleanor from their conversation. She returned to her book, but the words on the page remained unread as she considered the interaction. There was a certain freedom in being underestimated, in being invisible. These young lawyers spoke freely around her precisely because they saw her as unimportant, an older woman alone with a book not worth considering as an intellectual equal. Eleanor gathered her things slowly, sliding her book into her worn leather bag. As she stood to leave, the bell above the door chimed again. A young woman entered, her eyes scanning the cafe before landing on Eleanor. Recognition bloomed immediately on her face. "Justice Mitchell?" she called out, her voice clear and carrying, easily through the small space. I thought that was you. The cafe fell silent. Time seemed to freeze as the young woman's words hung in the air. Justice Mitchell? Eleanor turned to face the newcomer, recognizing her as Diane Chen, a first-year law clerk for Judge Ramirez on the D.C. Circuit. They had met at a judicial conference last month. "Hello, Diane," Eleanor said warmly, though her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "How are you?" "I'm well, Your Honor. I'm sorry to interrupt your Saturday." Diane clutched a legal pad to her chest, clearly starstruck. "Judge Ramirez mentioned you might be here. He needs your input on the amicus brief for the Harmon case if you have a moment." At the nearby table, the three lawyers had gone completely still. The red-haired man's coffee cup remained suspended halfway to his mouth. The woman with the sleek ponytail had turned an alarming shade of white. The man with glasses seemed to be trying very hard to become invisible. "Of course," Eleanor replied to Diane. "Just give me a moment." She turned back to the three lawyers, whose faces now displayed matching expressions of dawning horror. "You were saying something about constitutional analysis being best left to professionals?" Eleanor said, her voice level and calm. "I tend to agree, though I've found that the most professional legal minds are often those who remain open to perspectives they hadn't considered." The red-haired man set his coffee cup down with a shaky hand, sloshing liquid onto the table. "Justice Mitchell, we didn't realize it was me?" Eleanor finished for him. "Yes, that was rather obvious." The woman with the ponytail looked like she might be sick. "Your Honor, please accept our deepest apologies. Our comments were completely out of line, and—" Eleanor raised a hand, stopping her mid-sentence. "I don't need apologies. What I find interesting is how quickly you dismissed me when you thought I was just an ordinary citizen interested in the law. That says more about you than any apology could." She gathered her bag and turned to leave, then paused. "Oh, and for the record, I've never made my clerks write anything by hand. I take the metro at least twice a week, and I was paying rent in a one-bedroom apartment until my appointment to the federal bench at 43. She smiled slightly. "Just so your professional discussion can be based on facts rather than assumptions." With that, Eleanor joined Diane by the door, leaving behind three lawyers who looked as though they'd just seen their careers flash before their eyes. Outside, the spring air felt refreshing after the tension of the cafe. Eleanor took a deep breath, trying to release the knot that had formed in her stomach. "I'm sorry, Diane, but Judge Ramirez didn't really need me for an amicus brief, did he?" Diane's cheeks flushed. "No, Your Honor. I was getting coffee across the street and saw you through the window. Then I noticed those attorneys being rude to you and—" She trailed off, suddenly unsure of herself. "I hope I didn't overstep." Eleanor patted the young woman's arm. "Not at all. In fact, your timing was impeccable, though I suspect those three would have preferred you arrived about 10 minutes later." "Were they really criticizing your Commerce Clause opinion to your face without knowing who you were?" Diane asked, her eyes wide with disbelief. "They were indeed. Quite passionately, in fact. That's just—" Diane seemed unable to find words strong enough to describe the situation. "Unfortunate, but educational," Eleanor supplied. "It's not often I get to hear such unfiltered feedback." They walked slowly down the tree-lined street. Eleanor had planned to spend the morning alone with her book, but now found herself appreciating the company. "So," she said after a moment, "since you rescued me from my peaceful Saturday morning, the least you can do is join me for a proper cup of tea somewhere else." Diane beamed. "I'd be honored, Justice Mitchell." "Eleanor, please, at least when I'm not wearing the robe." They found another cafe a few blocks away, this one busier and less conducive to eavesdropping. As they settled at a small table with their drinks, Eleanor found herself curious about the young clerk. "Tell me, Diane, what did you think of my Commerce Clause opinion? And please be honest, I've already had my feelings bruised once today. I can handle a second round." Diane hesitated, stirring her tea nervously. I thought, the reasoning was sound, but I struggled with the implications for regulatory authority." "Go on," Eleanor encouraged. The limitation you placed on federal oversight makes sense constitutionally, but practically speaking, it creates a patchwork of state regulations that businesses will exploit, especially tech companies that operate across state lines but aren't bound by traditional commerce restrictions. Eleanor nodded thoughtfully. That's a fair criticism. More nuanced than classic boomer take, at least. Diane nearly choked on her tea. They didn't actually say that. Oh, they said much worse, Eleanor assured her with a small laugh. But there was something refreshing about it, too. No one speaks to me that honestly anymore. Everyone's too careful, too deferential. Because you're a Supreme Court justice, Diane pointed out. Your decisions shape the law of the land. True, but that doesn't make me infallible. Eleanor traced the rim of her teacup thoughtfully. Sometimes I miss the days of vigorous debate with colleagues who weren't afraid to tell me I was wrong. Back at Capitol Brews, the three lawyers remained at their table, though their lively discussion had died a quick and painful death. The woman with the ponytail had her head in her hands. Red hair was frantically searching something on his phone. Glasses stared blankly into the middle distance. "We're finished," the woman moaned through her fingers. "Completely, utterly finished." "It can't be that bad," Glasses said, though his voice lacked conviction. She seemed understanding. Red hair looked up from his phone, his face ashen. "Do you know who she is? Really know?" Eleanor Mitchell argued 17 cases before the Supreme Court before she was appointed to the bench. She clerked for Justice Brennan. She's written 3 books on constitutional theory, and He trailed off, unable to complete the thought. Told her she should stick to fiction and leave legal analysis to the professionals. The woman finished for him, her voice hollow. "She's going to destroy us," Red Hair whispered. "One word from her to the partners at our firms, and we'll be doing document review in the basement for the next decade." "If we even keep our jobs," the woman added miserably. Glasses, who had been quiet, suddenly straightened. "Wait a minute. Why would she come to a cafe alone on a Saturday? No security, no clerks, no entourage?" "What does it matter?" Red Hair snapped. "It matters because she chose to be normal today, to be just another person reading a book, and we ruined it by being complete jerks." The woman lifted her head from her hands. "So what do we do?" "I don't know about you two," Glasses said, standing up, "but I'm going to find her and apologize properly." "Are you insane?" Red Hair hissed, pulling him back down. "We need to lay low and pray she doesn't remember our faces. In a city full of brown-nosing lawyers, you think she'll forget the 3 idiots who insulted her to her face?" Glasses shook his head. "No, our only hope is to own this, completely." Meanwhile, in the second cafe, Eleanor and Diane's conversation had moved from legal theory to more personal matters. "My grandmother wanted me to be a doctor," Diane was saying. In her view, lawyers just help rich people get richer. Eleanor smiled. "And what made you choose law instead?" "I watched the Alvarez case oral arguments in my senior year of college. The way the justices engaged with the constitutional questions, the back and forth. It was like watching a beautiful, high-stakes chess match where the pieces were ideas. I was hooked." She hesitated, then added, "You were on the bench by then. Your questioning of the Solicitor General was brilliant." "Thank you," Eleanor said, genuinely touched. "Though I'm sure your grandmother would point out that medicine saves lives in a more direct way than constitutional theory. That's what she says at every family dinner," Diane admitted with a laugh. Eleanor's phone buzzed with a text message. She glanced at it and sighed. "It seems my quiet morning is officially over. There's an emergency conference call in 30 minutes. On a Saturday? Justice never sleeps, especially when there's a stay of execution petition involved." Eleanor gathered her things. "Thank you for the rescue and the conversation, Diane. Both were welcome." "The honor was mine," Diane said, rising as Eleanor stood to leave. As Eleanor walked out, she was surprised to find the man with glasses from the first cafe waiting outside. He stepped forward nervously as she appeared. "Justice Mitchell," he said, his voice unsteady, "I owe you an apology. Eleanor regarded him with raised eyebrows. Just you? Not your friends? They're still processing. But I couldn't let you leave thinking we're always like that. What we did was inexcusable. And yet here you are excusing it. He flinched at her words but stood his ground. No, I'm not. There's no excuse, He took a deep breath. The thing is, I've admired your work for years. Your dissent in Westlake was what got me through my constitutional law final. And today, instead of showing any of that respect, I acted like an arrogant fool. Eleanor studied him for a moment. There seemed to be genuine remorse in his expression, though whether it was for his behavior or for the potential consequences to his career, she couldn't be sure. What's your name? She asked. Peter Reynolds, Your Honor. 2nd year at Bailey. And Wong. Well, Mr. Reynolds, I appreciate you tracking me down to apologize. That shows character, at least. She paused, then added, If you genuinely admire my work, perhaps you should read yesterday's opinion more carefully. You might find that the reasoning isn't as circular as you thought. He nodded quickly. I will, absolutely. Good. Eleanor checked her watch. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a conference call waiting. As she walked away, she heard him call after her. Justice Mitchell, for what it's worth, I really am sorry we ruined your quiet morning. Eleanor paused but didn't turn around. Next time you see an older woman alone with a book, Mr. Reynolds, consider that she might have something valuable to contribute to your conversation, whether she's on the Supreme Court or not. With that, she continued down the street already, mentally shifting from her interrupted Saturday piece to the life or death legal questions awaiting her attention. Behind her, Peter Reynolds stood watching, the weight of the encounter settling on him like a judge's gavel, final and transformative. The emergency conference call lasted well into the afternoon. By the time Eleanor returned to her brownstone, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across her living room. She kicked off her shoes and sank into her favorite armchair, finally allowing herself to feel the full weight of the morning's encounter. The stay of execution had been granted, a temporary reprieve for a man on death row while new DNA evidence was examined. These were the moments that reminded Eleanor why she had pursued law in the first place. The chance to ensure justice was served with care and deliberation, not haste and certainty. But her mind kept returning to those 3 lawyers in the cafe, their dismissive attitudes, their assumptions, the way they had looked at her, or rather looked through her, when they thought she was just an ordinary older woman. Her phone rang, pulling her from her thoughts. It was her sister, Grace. I was just about to give up on you, Grace said when Eleanor answered. Did you forget about our dinner plans? Eleanor closed her eyes. I'm so sorry. There was an emergency call and then, say no more. The job comes first. I get it. Grace's voice held no resentment, only the weary acceptance of someone who had long ago adjusted to her sister's demanding career. Rain check for tomorrow? Absolutely, Eleanor promised. And I'll cook this time. Ha, I've tasted your cooking, Ellie. I'll bring takeout. After they hung up, Eleanor sat in the growing darkness of her living room, thinking about the paths her life had taken, the choices that had led her to the highest court in the land, but also to a Saturday night alone in an empty house. The weight of decisions that affected millions, but also the weight of dinners missed, birthdays forgotten, relationships that had withered under the constant pressure of her work. The 3 lawyers from the cafe probably imagined her life was one of pure privilege and power. They couldn't see the sacrifices, the loneliness that sometimes accompanied her position, just as they couldn't see the intelligence and value in an older woman reading quietly in a corner. Her doorbell rang, startling her from her reflections. Eleanor wasn't expecting anyone, and few people had her home address. Security concerns meant she was careful about visitors. She approached the door cautiously and peered through the peephole. Standing on her doorstep was the woman with the ponytail, from the cafe, clutching what looked like a thick envelope. Eleanor opened the door, keeping the security chain latched. Can I help you? The woman looked surprised, as if she hadn't expected Eleanor to answer her own door. Justice Mitchell, I'm Vanessa Taylor from Hodgkins and Price. We, met this morning. She shifted uncomfortably. I apologize for coming to your home. The clerk at the Supreme Court building gave me your address after I explained the situation. Eleanor made a mental note to have a serious conversation with her staff about privacy protocols. That was highly inappropriate of them. What do you want, Miss Taylor? Vanessa held out the envelope. I wanted to apologize in person and give you this. Eleanor regarded her coolly through the gap in the door. You could have sent an apology letter through official channels. I know, but... Vanessa took a deep breath. My grandmother raised me. She worked as a janitor at a law firm for 40 years. The lawyers there treated her like she was invisible. They'd have conversations about her age, her accent, her education, right in front of her as if she couldn't hear or understand. What I did to you today was exactly what I swore I'd never do to anyone. I became the thing I hated most. Eleanor's expression softened slightly. She closed the door, removed the security chain, and reopened it. Come in, Miss Taylor, but briefly. I have a call with the Chief Justice in 30 minutes. That was a lie. She had no such call, but it gave her an easy exit if needed. Vanessa stepped inside, her eyes widening as she took in Eleanor's home. It wasn't the grand mansion most people expected a Supreme Court justice to have. It was comfortable but modest, filled with books and art collected over a lifetime. Would you like some tea? Eleanor asked, more out of ingrained politeness than genuine hospitality. No, thank you. I won't stay long. Vanessa handed her the envelope. This is for you. Eleanor opened it and pulled out a stack of papers, a printout of her Commerce Clause opinion, covered in handwritten notes. I read it again, Vanessa explained. Really read it this time without the knee-jerk reaction. I marked up my thoughts. There are still parts I disagree with, but... She hesitated. It's brilliant work. The way you thread historical context with modern application. I missed that completely on my first read. Eleanor flipped through the pages, skimming Vanessa's notes. They were thoughtful, specific, and devoid of the dismissive tone she'd used in the cafe. Why bring me this? Because I was wrong. Not just about how I treated you, but about your legal reasoning. And I wanted you to know that I can recognize when I'm wrong. Vanessa met Eleanor's gaze directly. Also, there's a letter in there, an official complaint. Against myself. Eleanor raised her eyebrows. A complaint? For conduct unbecoming an officer of the court. I've already filed it with the DC bar. You were right about what you said to Peter. How we treated you says more about us than any apology could. I need to face consequences for that. Eleanor studied the young lawyer standing in her living room. There was something refreshing about her directness, even if it came after such a poor first impression. Self-flagellation isn't necessary, Ms. Taylor. We all make mistakes. This wasn't just a mistake, it was a reflection of something ugly in me that I need to address. Vanessa straightened her shoulders. Anyway, that's all I came to say. Thank you for your time, Justice Mitchell. As she turned to leave, Eleanor found herself saying, Your grandmother, is she still alive? Vanessa paused. Yes, she lives with me now. Tell her about today, all of it. I think she'll appreciate the symmetry. A small smile crossed Vanessa's face. I already did. She laughed for 5 straight minutes, then told me I'd finally gotten the lesson she'd been trying to teach me for years. After Vanessa left, Eleanor returned to her armchair with the annotated opinion. She began reading through the notes, surprised by their insight. Vanessa Taylor, for all her initial rudeness, had a sharp, legal mind. The next morning, Eleanor decided to try a different cafe for her Sunday ritual. As much as she hated to admit it, the encounter at Capitol Brews had shaken her more than she wanted to acknowledge. But 3 blocks from her home, she found herself turning back. She wouldn't let 3 rude lawyers drive her from her favorite spot. When she arrived, the Sunday crowd was different. Families with children, older couples sharing newspapers. Eleanor took her usual corner table and opened her book. The quiet, normalcy was comforting. 10 minutes later, the bell above the door chimed. Eleanor glanced up to see the red-haired lawyer from yesterday entering. He scanned the room, spotted her, and froze. For a moment he seemed to consider turning around and leaving. Instead, he squared his shoulders and approached her table. "Justice Mitchell," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm Thomas Walsh from yesterday." "I remember," Eleanor replied coolly. "I came to apologize, but I see you're reading. I don't want to disturb you again." He placed a business card on the table. "If you ever need anything, legal research, document review, coffee delivery, please call, day or night." Eleanor picked up the card. "Are you offering to be my personal assistant, Mr. Walsh?" He swallowed hard. "I'm offering to make amends in whatever way I can. And you think being at my beck and call is the way to do that?" "I don't know," he admitted. "I just know I can't undo what happened, but I can try to balance the scales somehow." Eleanor studied him for a moment. Unlike Vanessa, whose apology had seemed genuine and self-reflective, Thomas appeared motivated primarily by fear. Fear of career repercussions, of powerful enemies, of burned bridges. "Mr. Walsh, do you know why I come here every weekend?" He shook his head. "Because here I'm not Justice Mitchell. I'm just Eleanor, a woman who enjoys good tea and classic literature. The greatest gift you could give me isn't servitude, it's normalcy." She handed him back his card. "If you want to make amends, treat the next older woman you meet with the respect and consideration you'd show to anyone whose good opinion matters to you. That would balance the scales more than any favor you could do for me." Thomas took back his card, looking slightly bewildered. "Is that really all you want?" "That, and perhaps a bit more awareness of your volume when discussing Supreme Court justices in public spaces," Eleanor added with a hint of a smile. After he left, Eleanor returned to her book, but her mind was elsewhere. The three lawyers, Peter, Vanessa, and Thomas, had each responded differently to the revelation of her identity. Peter with genuine remorse, Vanessa with self-reflection, Thomas with fear and calculation. Three different paths forward from the same mistake. Later that afternoon, Eleanor sat in her home office drafting notes for an upcoming opinion. Her phone buzzed with an email notification from the Supreme Court clerk who had given out her address. "Justice Mitchell," the email began. "I've received inquiries from 2 more attorneys from Hodgkins and Price seeking to deliver personal apologies. I declined to provide your address but wanted to inform you. Also, a Peter Reynolds called 3 times asking if he could send you his analysis of your Commerce Clause opinion. Shall I have these communications directed through official channels? Or would you prefer we block them entirely?" Eleanor sighed. What had begun as a simple desire for a quiet Saturday morning had somehow spiraled into an ongoing saga. Part of her wanted to shut it all down, to retreat behind the formal barriers of her position and prevent any further intrusions into her personal space. But another part, the part that had become a lawyer to make a difference, saw an opportunity here. These young attorneys had been humbled, yes, but they'd also been humanized. They'd seen the person behind the position, and wasn't that something worth nurturing? She clicked reply and began to type. "Thank you for your diligence. Please inform any inquiring attorneys that I do not accept personal visits or communications at my home. However, I will be giving a lecture on constitutional interpretation at Georgetown Law next month. They are welcome to attend and participate in the Q&A session afterward. As for Mr. Reynolds, please tell him I look forward to reading his analysis if he submits it through proper channels." Eleanor pressed send, then sat back in her chair. Tomorrow, she would return to the Supreme Court, don her black robe, and resume her role as one of the 9 most powerful legal minds in the country. But today, for what remained of the weekend, she was still just Eleanor, a woman with a book, seeking a moment of peace in a noisy world. 1 month later, the lecture hall at Georgetown Law School was filled to capacity. Students and faculty members had arrived early to secure seats, but the back row was conspicuously occupied by 3 familiar faces. Peter, Vanessa, and Thomas sat stiffly next to each other, looking more like defendants awaiting sentencing than attendees at an academic lecture. "I can't believe we're doing this," Thomas muttered, tugging at his collar. "She probably won't even remember us." Vanessa gave him a withering look. "Of course she'll remember us. We're probably the only lawyers in D.C. who insulted her to her face without knowing who she was." "Keep your voice down," Peter hissed, glancing around nervously. "The last thing we need is for everyone here to know about that." "Too late," said a voice behind them. They turned to see Diane Chen, the law clerk who had recognized Justice Mitchell in the cafe. "Word gets around. Half the law school knows about the cafe incident by now." Thomas groaned and slid lower in his seat. "What are you doing here?" Vanessa asked Diane. "Justice Mitchell invited me." Diane nodded toward the front row, where several seats were reserved. "I'm sitting with the other clerks. I just wanted to come say hello and see how you three are holding up after your brush with infamy." Before any of them could respond, the room fell silent as Eleanor Mitchell walked onto the stage. Gone was the casual woman in jeans and a cardigan. Today she wore a tailored navy suit, her silver hair swept into an elegant knot. She looked every inch the Supreme Court justice, commanding, dignified, formidable. "Good afternoon," she began, her voice carrying easily through the packed hall. "I was asked to speak today about constitutional interpretation in a changing world. But before I begin, I'd like to share a story that happened to me recently, one that I believe illustrates an important point about perspective and judgment." In the back row, Peter, Vanessa, and Thomas exchanged alarmed glances. "She wouldn't," Thomas whispered. "A few weeks ago," Eleanor continued, "I was sitting in a cafe, dressed casually, reading a book. No black robe, no title preceding my name, just a person enjoying a quiet morning. Nearby, a group of young attorneys were having an animated discussion about one of my recent opinions. A murmur rippled through the audience. Peter closed his eyes in mortification. "These attorneys," Eleanor went on, "had strong views about my ruling. Very strong views, expressed rather colorfully." Her lips curved in a slight smile. "They were unaware, of course, that the author of the opinion they were critiquing was sitting just a few feet away." The audience was completely silent now, hanging on her every word. When I eventually identified myself, their reactions were memorable. She paused, scanning the room until her eyes found the three lawyers in the back row. But what struck me most was not their criticism of my legal reasoning. It was how quickly they had dismissed me when they thought I was just an ordinary older woman, how they assumed I couldn't possibly understand complicated legal stuff, as one of them put it. Vanessa's face burned with shame. "I share this story, not to embarrass anyone," Eleanor continued, though her gaze lingered on the back row, "but because it illustrates something fundamental about how we approach the Constitution. Too often, we make assumptions based on superficial factors. We dismiss perspectives that don't match our preconceptions. We fail to see the wisdom in unexpected places." For the next hour, Eleanor delivered a masterful lecture on constitutional interpretation, weaving in historical context, case studies, and thoughtful analysis. The three lawyers in the back row gradually relaxed as it became clear she wasn't going to explicitly identify them or dwell further on their encounter. When she opened the floor for questions, hands shot up throughout the audience. Eleanor fielded each query with precision and insight, demonstrating the intellectual rigor that had earned her a place on the nation's highest court. Finally, she pointed to the back row. "Yes, Mr. Reynolds?" Peter looked startled at being called on by name. He stood nervously, aware of all eyes turning toward him. "Justice Mitchell, thank you for your lecture. I've been thinking a lot about your Commerce Clause opinion since our last encounter. I've come to appreciate the nuance of your reasoning, but I'm still troubled by one aspect." He paused, clearly wondering if he should proceed with criticism. "Go on," Eleanor encouraged. "This is an academic setting. Robust debate is not only allowed but encouraged." Emboldened, Peter continued, "Your opinion relies heavily on the original understanding of interstate commerce, but technology, has created forms of commerce the founders couldn't have imagined. At what point do we acknowledge that originalism has its limits when applied to a digital economy? It was a thoughtful question, more nuanced than anything he'd said in the cafe that day. Eleanor nodded approvingly. An excellent point, Mr. Reynolds. The tension between originalist principles and technological advancement is one the court grapples with constantly. She launched into a detailed response that acknowledged the complexity of the issue without conceding her fundamental position. Peter sat down looking satisfied, not because she had agreed with him, but because she had engaged with his question seriously. After the lecture, a reception was held in an adjacent room. Faculty members and select students crowded around Eleanor, eager to continue the discussion in a less formal setting. Peter, Vanessa, and Thomas hovered uncertainly at the edges of the gathering, unsure if they should stay or slip away unnoticed. "She's looking at us," Thomas muttered, nudging Vanessa. Indeed, Eleanor had glanced their way several times while speaking with a constitutional law professor. "Stop being paranoid," Vanessa replied. "She's not thinking about us anymore." But a few minutes later, they watched as Eleanor excused herself from her conversation and made her way directly toward them. The three lawyers straightened, exchanging panicked looks. "Mr. Reynolds, Ms. Taylor, Mr. Walsh." Eleanor greeted them, using their names with perfect recall. "I'm glad you could attend." "Thank you for inviting us, Justice Mitchell," Vanessa replied, finding her voice first. "Your lecture was fascinating." Eleanor nodded. "I was particularly interested in your annotations on my opinion, Ms. Taylor. You raised several points that merit further consideration." Vanessa blinked in surprise. "You actually read my notes?" "Of course, I always appreciate thoughtful feedback, even, perhaps especially, when it challenges my thinking." Eleanor turned to Peter. "And thank you for your question, Mr. Reynolds. It's precisely the kind of dialogue I was hoping to encourage today." Peter seemed at a loss for words, finally managing. "It's an honor to have this conversation with you, Your Honor. A real conversation, I mean, not like before." Eleanor's eyes crinkled with amusement. "Indeed. Amazing how much more productive discussions can be when everyone is recognized as a full participant, isn't it?" Thomas, who had remained silent, suddenly blurted out, "Why aren't you angry with us?" Eleanor regarded him with raised eyebrows. "Would you prefer that I was, Mr. Walsh?" "No, I don't understand. We were incredibly rude to you. You could have reported us to our firms, to the Bar Association. You could have ended our careers with a single phone call." "I could have," Eleanor agreed. "But what purpose would that serve? Retribution? I've never found that particularly satisfying or useful." "Then why invite us here today?" Vanessa asked. "Why acknowledge us at all?" Eleanor considered the question. "Because moments of failure often present the greatest opportunities for growth. The three of you made a mistake, one rooted in assumptions and biases that unfortunately are all too common. But mistakes can be powerful teachers if we're willing to learn from them." She glanced around the room, where dozens of law students were watching their interaction with undisguised curiosity. "Besides, I suspect this experience will stay with you far longer than any formal reprimand could. Sometimes the most effective consequences are those that force us to confront our own behavior." A student approached, holding a copy of Eleanor's book on constitutional theory. Eleanor excused herself to sign it, leaving the three lawyers to digest her words. "She's something else," Peter said quietly. "Nothing like what I expected." "None of this is what I expected," Vanessa replied. "I thought she'd either ignore us completely or find some way to punish us. I never imagined she'd turn it into a teaching." "Moment." Thomas shook his head. "I still don't get it. In her position, I'd want revenge." "That's because you think like a litigator," said a new voice. They turned to see Diane approaching with a glass of sparkling water. "Justice Mitchell thinks like a justice. She's not interested in winning or losing. She's interested in what serves the greater good." "And she thinks we're worth saving?" Thomas asked skeptically. Diane shrugged. "She thinks everyone deserves the chance to become better than they were. That's why she became a judge in the first place. To protect that Chance for all of us. Across the room, Eleanor was deep in conversation with a group of students. Her face animated as she explained a fine point of constitutional interpretation. Watching her, Peter felt a strange mix of embarrassment and inspiration. "I've been thinking about changing firms," he said suddenly. "Moving into public interest law." Vanessa looked at him in surprise. "Since when?" "Since the cafe," Peter admitted. "Or maybe since before, but I wasn't honest with myself about it. Corporate law pays well, but it's not why I went to law school." "What did you go for?" Thomas asked. Peter's eyes remained on Justice Mitchell. "To make a difference, to help people who really need it." He smiled ruefully. "Sounds cheesy, I know." "A little," Vanessa agreed. "But also admirable." Later, as the reception was winding down, Eleanor found herself alone for a moment near the windows overlooking the campus. She was tired. These events always drained her, but satisfied with how the day had unfolded. The lecture had gone well. The questions had been thoughtful, and yes, her little experiment with the 3 lawyers seemed to be yielding interesting results. She hadn't planned to single them out. The invitation to the lecture had been a spontaneous gesture, born partly from curiosity about how they would respond. Would they come? Would they hide? Would they learn? Justice Mitchell? She turned to find Vanessa approaching hesitantly. "Yes, Ms. Taylor? I just wanted to say thank you, not just for the lecture, but for how you've handled everything. My grandmother asked me to tell you that you have her respect, which is not something she gives easily, especially to people in positions of power." Eleanor smiled. "Please tell her the feeling is mutual. It takes character to raise a granddaughter who can recognize and learn from her mistakes." Vanessa nodded. "I'm trying. It's not always easy to see yourself clearly." "No," Eleanor agreed, thinking of her own blind spots, her own failures over the years. "It never is, but it's always worth the effort." As she watched Vanessa rejoin her colleagues, Eleanor reflected on the strange journey that had begun with a simple desire for a quiet Saturday morning. In her 30 years of legal practice, she had argued before the Supreme Court, written decisions that shaped the law of the land, and navigated the highest levels of power in Washington. But sometimes the most meaningful impact came from the smallest interactions: a chance encounter in a cafe, a moment of humility, a lesson learned not from a legal tome, but from a human connection. The next Saturday, Eleanor returned to Capitol. Bruise. She took her usual corner table, ordered her usual tea, and opened her book. The cafe was busy, filled with the weekend crowd. Students with laptops, couples in conversation, individuals lost in their own thoughts. For 2 peaceful hours, not a single person recognized her. And that, Eleanor thought as she sipped her tea, was exactly as it should be. 1 year later, Eleanor sat in her chambers reviewing a brief for an upcoming case. The wall clock showed just past 8 p.m., another late night in a career full of them. Her clerk had left hours ago, promising to return early the next morning with fresh research on a tricky jurisdictional question. A knock at her door pulled her attention from the document. "Come in," she called, expecting the evening security guard on his rounds. Instead, her assistant Patricia poked her head in. "Sorry to interrupt, Justice Mitchell, but there's someone here to see you. He doesn't have an appointment, but he says it's important." Eleanor removed her reading glasses. "Who is it?" "A Peter Reynolds. He says you'll remember him." A small smile tugged at Eleanor's lips. "Yes, I certainly do. Send him in, please." Peter entered, looking very different from the confident young attorney who had dismissed her in the cafe a year ago. His suit was less expensive, his haircut less polished, but there was something more settled about him, as if he had found his footing in the world. "Justice Mitchell, thank you for seeing me without an appointment." He held a thick manila envelope in his hands, fidgeting with the clasp. "I know how valuable your time is. Have a seat, Mr. Reynolds. What brings you to the court at this hour?" Peter sat on the edge of the chair across from her desk. "I wanted to deliver this personally." He handed her the envelope. "It's my first major filing as lead counsel, class action on behalf of elderly residents in low-income housing developments who are being forced out by a developer's questionable interpretation of zoning laws. Eleanor raised an eyebrow as she accepted the envelope. You've left corporate law, then? 6 months ago. Peter nodded. I'm with the Housing Rights Coalition now. The pay is about a third of what I made at Bailey and Wong, but... He shrugged. I sleep better. And this filing is before the Supreme Court? Eleanor asked, glancing at the envelope. No, it's still at district level, but the core question involves constitutional issues that might eventually reach you. Peter hesitated. That's not really why I'm here, though. I didn't think it was, Eleanor said gently. Why are you here, Mr. Reynolds? Peter took a deep breath. To tell you that you changed my life. That day in the cafe and then at Georgetown, it made me reevaluate everything. Not just my career, but how I see people, how I judge them, how I move through the world. Eleanor set the envelope on her desk. That's quite a dramatic impact for one chance encounter. It wasn't just the encounter, Peter explained. It was how you handled it. You could have humiliated us. You could have used your power to punish us. Instead, you turned it into a lesson, not just about respect, but about seeing beyond our assumptions. He met her eyes directly. I've thought about that almost every day since. And your colleagues, Ms. Taylor and Mr. Walsh? Have they experienced similar epiphanies? There was a hint of amusement in Eleanor's voice. Peter smiled slightly. Vanessa is still at Hodgkins and Price, but she's taken on a significant pro bono caseload. She's representing immigrants facing deportation. As for Thomas, he shook his head. He's exactly the same, still chasing big clients and bigger paychecks. Some people don't change, I guess. Or perhaps they need more time, Eleanor suggested. Change is rarely simultaneous for everyone. Maybe. Peter didn't sound convinced. Anyway, I just wanted you to know that what happened that day mattered, at least to me. Eleanor studied him for a moment. There was an earnestness about Peter Reynolds that hadn't been there a year ago, a humility that seemed genuine rather than performative. I appreciate you telling me this, she said finally. In this job, it's rare to see the direct impact of one's actions. We issue opinions that affect millions of lives, but we seldom witness the specific differences they make. She gestured to the stacks of briefs on her desk. It's all rather abstract most of the time. Is that difficult, the abstraction? Eleanor considered the question, surprised by his insight. Sometimes, law should serve people, real people with real lives. It's easy to forget that when you're debating the finer points of statutory interpretation at this level. That's why you go to the cafe, Peter realized, to stay connected to the world outside these walls. Among other reasons, Eleanor acknowledged, I also simply enjoy the tea. They both smiled at that, a moment of unexpected connection across the vast differences in their positions and experiences. I should let you get back to your work, Peter said, rising from his chair. Thank you again for seeing me. Thank you for the update, Mr. Reynolds. I'll be interested to see how your case progresses. At the door, Peter paused. By the way, I still go to Capitol Brews sometimes. I've never seen you there again. I found a new cafe, Eleanor replied. Quieter. Less likelihood of running into lawyers who might critique my opinions to my face. Peter laughed. Fair enough. After he left, Eleanor sat for a long time thinking about the strange threads that connected lives, how a moment of rudeness followed by a moment of recognition had altered the course of a promising young lawyer. Had she known that Saturday morning a year ago that her quiet reading time would turn into such a catalyst? Of course not. Which was precisely why she treasured those anonymous hours away from the court. In the unplanned intersections of lives, some of the most meaningful changes began. 6 months later, Eleanor sat at her new favorite cafe, a small establishment 4 blocks from her home. The owner, an elderly Lebanese man named Fareed, made the best mint tea she had ever tasted and never seemed to recognize her as anything other than a regular customer who tipped well and kept to herself. She was deep in her book, Tolstoy this time, when a shadow fell across her table. Looking up, she was surprised to see Vanessa Taylor standing there, holding a to-go cup and looking uncertain. Justice Mitchell. I'm sorry to disturb you. I was just passing by and saw you through the window. Ms. Taylor. Eleanor closed her book. Please join me if you have a moment. Vanessa sat down, glancing around the cafe. So this is where you disappeared to. Peter said you'd found a new spot after. She trailed off, still uncomfortable with the memory. After being accosted by opinionated young lawyers? Eleanor finished for her, a twinkle in her eye. Yes. Though I do still visit Capitol Brews occasionally. Their blueberry scones are unmatched. Vanessa smiled. Peter told me he came to see you about his new job. He did. He mentioned you're doing immigration work now? Pro bono cases, yes. My firm actually created a dedicated pro bono department and I'm heading it up. Vanessa looked down at her coffee cup. My grandmother passed away 3 months ago. I'm very sorry to hear that, Eleanor said, her voice softening. Before she died, she made me promise I'd use my education and privilege to help people who don't have a voice in the system. People like her, who others too often dismiss or ignore. Vanessa met Eleanor's gaze. So that's what I'm trying to do. Eleanor nodded, understanding the weight of such promises. She would be proud, I think. I hope so. Vanessa hesitated. I also wanted to tell you that your Commerce Clause opinion, the one we were criticizing that day, was cited last week in a case I'm working on. The judge used your reasoning about regulatory overreach to block a deportation order that would have separated a family. 3 children got to keep their mother because of words you wrote. Eleanor felt a rush of satisfaction more powerful than any she'd experienced from favorable mentions in legal journals or academic praise. This was the real measure of her work, not the elegant legal reasoning or the careful balancing of precedents, but the tangible impact on human lives. Thank you for telling me that, she said simply. As Vanessa left, Eleanor returned to her book, but her mind kept drifting to the unlikely connection between that Saturday morning confrontation and the family who would remain together because of it. The law was full of such invisible threads connecting actions to consequences in ways no one could fully predict. 2 weeks later, Eleanor was working late again when the Chief Justice stopped by her chambers. I've been meaning to ask you, he said, settling into the chair across from her desk. What's this I hear about you mentoring young lawyers from private firms, starting some kind of formal program? Eleanor looked up in surprise. I'm not sure. What you mean? There's a rumor going around the D.C. Bar Association that you've taken several young attorneys under your wing. Something about transformative experiences and career changes. He chuckled. Apparently you're developing quite a reputation as an inspirational figure. That's an exaggeration, Eleanor said carefully. I did have an interesting encounter with a few attorneys that led to some ongoing connections, but there's no formal program. Well, whatever you're doing, it's having an impact. I just had lunch with Judge Harmon, and he was singing the praises of this young lawyer who left corporate work to join the Housing Rights Coalition. Apparently, the young man credited you with changing his entire outlook on the law. Eleanor smiled slightly. Peter Reynolds, yes, I'm familiar with his work. And then there's Vanessa Taylor at Hodgkins and Price. Word is she's turned down partnership track to run their new pro bono department. Also cites you as her inspiration. The legal community does love its gossip, Eleanor observed. The Chief Justice studied her with curiosity. You know, in all the years we've served together, I've never quite figured you out, Eleanor. Most of us on the court are fairly predictable in our approaches, our philosophies. But you surprise me sometimes. I'll take that as a compliment, Eleanor replied. It was meant as one. He stood to leave. Whatever you did to inspire these young lawyers, perhaps you should do more of it. The profession could use the help. After he left, Eleanor turned to the window, looking out at the Washington Monument illuminated against the night sky. She thought about Peter and Vanessa, about the family spared separation, about the elderly residents fighting to keep their homes. She thought about the cafe, about being seen and not seen for who she truly was. The following Saturday, Eleanor, returned to Capitol Brews for the first time in months. As she settled into her old corner table with her book and tea, she glanced around at the other patrons, students, couples, solitary readers like herself. Any one of them might be someone whose path would intersect meaningfully with hers. Any conversation overheard, any moment of recognition or misrecognition, might spark a change that would ripple outward in ways she could never anticipate. That was the beauty of stepping outside the court, outside her role, outside the expectations that came with her title. In the simple act of being just another person in a cafe, she found not only peace but possibility. Eleanor opened her book and began to read, waiting for whatever might happen next.